Hi, I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we speak with Ellie Cole. Cole, of course, is a childhood cancer survivor whose right leg was amputated when she was 3. Within 8 weeks of that operation, she was swimming as a form of rehab, and she ultimately went on to become the most decorated Aussie female Paralympian of all time, with 17 medals over 4 games. In recent years, she's become a rising star in Australian sports media as a trusted and charismatic broadcaster, not to mention a staunch disability advocate. She joins us today with a new title, children's book author. Cole recently became a mum to her little boy Felix, and her new book, Felix and His Fantastic Friends, is inspired by his adventures in early childhood and her own in motherhood. And hosting this conversation about everything from Cole's relationship with her twin sister to the arcane challenges of Paralympic classification is a man who's covered Cole's final games in Tokyo in 2021, and that's Sydney Morning Herald sports journalist Tom Decent.
Thank you, Conrad. Well, it's a huge pleasure to welcome Ellie Cole into the Good Weekend studios. So what's harder, Ellie? Winning multiple Paralympic gold medals, presenting on live television, being a mum, or writing a children's book, which is very good, by the way.
Thank you. Is there an option for all of the above there? I think a lot of people think winning a gold medal is hard, but it's actually the work to get there that's hard. The winning bit's just putting it all together, so maybe not so much. Being a mum, I think training for being an athlete actually got me ready for being a mum because I was waking up at 4 o'clock every morning. I'm still doing exactly the same thing as a mum. So I was kind of born for that. Writing a children's book's probably been the hardest because it's an area that I'm absolutely not familiar with. And I got a lot of writer's block. I don't know how you write every day, Tom, because it's so difficult.
Particularly when there's a loud crowd and you're at a stadium or a pool and the crowd is going full on and you have to send that copy off very, very soon. But how was the deadline world? The
deadline world was fine. I love working towards a deadline. When I was an athlete, we always had the deadline of being a World Championships or a Paralympic Games. And so I always had a really good plan to how to work backwards from that. And it was no different with writing a children's book. And it's probably going to be no different with any industry that an athlete works in. But when you have the writer's block and you don't have anybody else there to tell you what to do, like when you're an athlete, like you just do this and you'll be fine. That was the challenging part. And pulling out, the creativity was really challenging as well. But I loved it. I knew that I had a good story to tell, and I knew that it was an important message to get out to the world. And I think that helped me a lot when I was experiencing writer's block because I would always just fall back on why I was doing it in the first place.
We will get onto the book. You are a very busy person. Was there a deadline on the Ellie Cole swimming arena that you're building at the moment as well? Can you tell us about that little project on your Insta?
Absolutely. So I purchased this house about 1.5 years ago with my partner. We were expecting our first child, Felix, and we bought this place that was maybe built about 40 years ago and has not been renovated since. And the backyard was very Italian. And I thought, this place is very well built. I probably won't touch anything, but the backyard, we need a swimming pool in there, of course. I can't be an athlete and a swimmer without having a swimming pool. And so the last 4 months or something, we've been renovating our entire backyard. We've put a swimming pool in there. So Felix loves swimming, my son, and he'll be definitely jumping in every day. He already wants to jump in. It's not heated or anything yet, and there's still like tile fragments in the bottom. But the Ellie Cole Swimming Centre is coming to life, and I shan't be raising my heart rate above 90 when I'm in there. I'll probably just be laying on a little lilo. Maybe you have a nice beverage in my hand and enjoy the sun and relaxing after a very long swimming career.
You are Australia's most decorated female Paralympian. I'm fascinated in athletes after they give up their sport, whether they like to still dabble in it recreationally. Do you still swim? Like, do you have the bug to get out and bang out a few laps?
I don't. I would love to. I still love and enjoy swimming when I do. I think I've only swum maybe 3 times in the last 2.5, 3 years since I've retired. It's just such an effort to go to a swimming pool and you get your hair wet. It's a lot of effort after as well. What I have done is I've built this home gym in my house. So I still train. I try 3 or 4 times a week. It's a bit hard when you have a son. a 1-year-old son for that matter. But the swimming side of things, to actually get in the car and drive to a swimming pool, just not really there yet.
And athletes are very active people. It was interesting. I was lucky enough to cover the tail end of your career. I believe I interviewed you before the Tokyo Paralympics and was one of a few handful of Australian newspaper journalists to go and cover those Paralympics, which were very unique, as we know, during the height of COVID. We would have done lockdown together, I presume, on our way back to Australia. I don't know about you, but how did you keep sane during that period after that in lockdown?
How did you go in there?
I hired an exercise bike. I paid $200 and they delivered it to my room and I sat on that bike for 2 weeks because I needed something to do. I don't know about you being an athlete in that period. It must have been pretty tricky.
So you went through the COVID lockdown shred. I did the same thing, actually. I would do this, I would have kind of the same routine every day where I would wake up and I would exercise straight away. And there was one day in there, I think it was about day 7, where I didn't do any exercise as soon as I woke up. And it was the hardest day in lockdown. I experienced so much anxiety, but I was getting up and exercising every day. And then there was nothing else to do. So I'd do a training session in the afternoon as well. And I was probably more fit leaving that hotel quarantine than I was when I was an athlete. But the bit that I did in the middle was eat like a bag of Doritos and like 6 Cornettos. When you're an athlete returning back from the Paralympic Games, I don't know if you remember, but a lot of athletes were receiving just like random gifts from people. They were just sending them straight to a hotel room. So I was getting all of these like baked goods, ice creams. People were sending me like Uber Eats, like Queen Chow for dinner. And I was like, this is so great. But I definitely overate, but also over-exercised probably too. There was nothing else to do in there, was there?
No. I had a friend who sent a carton of beer, but you weren't allowed the full case of beer. They rationed the beer each night because there were issues in quarantine for some people with alcohol. So a very wild experience, but it's so great to have you in and cover off your career and talk about the book as well. But tell us a little bit about your childhood as well, Ellie.
So I grew up in the eastern suburbs of Victoria. I was actually born as an able-bodied girl, which a lot of people don't know. I wasn't born with my disability, and I was born alongside my twin sister, who's also able-bodied. But I was diagnosed with cancer when I was about 2, and so I underwent this whole year of chemotherapy. I was stuck in hospitals, didn't really know what was happening. Like, how do you explain to a 2-year-old that they're so sick? And eventually the chemotherapy was making me more sick. It was killing a lot of my white blood cells than the actual cancer was. And so we had to stop that chemotherapy, but at risk of it spreading, we had to amputate my leg. And that's actually how I lost my leg. But the silver lining in that whole story is that a few weeks after my amputation, I was quite literally thrown into a swimming pool for rehabilitation. And that's where my whole swimming story began. And I loved the water. I loved the freedom that it gave me. I could take off my prosthetic. I could be the same as my twin sister. And nobody even knew that I was different when I was in the pool. And I loved that aspect of it. I loved being treated as an equal, because growing up in the 1990s with a disability, that wasn't necessarily the case. Disability isn't known as it is now. And, you didn't see people with disabilities in the community or even securing employment, definitely not on television, that's for sure. And the media portrayal was really negative. So it was not a good time in my life to acquire a disability, but I'm really thankful that I found sport and eventually the Paralympic movement when I was about 10 years old and went on to become a Paralympian. And with that platform was able to completely reshape the way that people perceive others with disabilities and in turn probably perceive what they can achieve within themselves as well. So it was a difficult start to my life, quite tumultuous, but finding sport, finding the Paralympics, like we've heard Dylan Alcott say, it saved his life. And if I look back at mine, it's made my life completely different to how my parents first imagined that it would be when they knew that their daughter was going to have a disability. So it's definitely opened up my world. In terms of becoming an elite athlete, I was actually really inspired by the Sydney 2000 Olympians. I loved Ian Thorpe, and it was amazing to be able to work on the Olympics with him in Paris as well. I just was pinching myself, and Gian Rooney, who was over in Paris with the 9 Network, I idolized her growing up as well. Like, there was this one training session I remember when I was little, and she was doing TheraBand exercises. She was still an athlete, and part of her TheraBand like popped off and landed in my lane, and I gave it to her, and she took it out of my hand, and I was like, this is the best day of my life. And I remember going back to my swimming club and telling the story about how Gian Rooney like her basically like rehabilitation equipment broke down into my lane. And it made our newsletter. Like it was awesome. So to be able to work on the Olympics with Dorothy and Gian was really cool. But they're the ones that really inspired me to become an elite athlete. I wasn't actually inspired by Paralympians because I didn't know about the Paralympics until I was around about 11 years old or 12 years old. And then once I discovered the Paralympics and I saw, double leg amputees bounding down athletics tracks and all of the amazing things that we saw in Paris with our athletes, I just was hooked and I couldn't wait to become a Paralympian. And it was awesome. It's been a great career.
Tell me about your relationship with your twin, Brittany. She is able-bodied but incredibly supportive throughout your childhood as well. Tell me about that dynamic growing up.
It's a really difficult thing for me to talk about and even comprehend, really, the relationship that I have with my sister, because obviously neither of us chose for me to become sick when I was little with cancer. And unfortunately, when there is a child that has cancer, that child is number one priority, to get them better and to get them rehabilitated and back on their feet again. And the siblings often become a bit of collateral damage in that process. So when I was sick, I was going through chemotherapy for a year. My siblings were all at home being taken care of by my father and my grandmother. And I think that long term, there's probably been a few consequences of that where, getting me better was first priority, and then focusing on my swimming career was a really big priority in my family as well. And my sister has always been that person that has always lifted me up. So she, was a really important part of my rehabilitation. She taught me how to walk again. She taught me how to ride a bike. She took me by the hand and pulled me along in her life and taught me how to do all of these incredible things that the doctors told me that I would never be able to do, climbing trees and roller skating and all of these amazing things. And so my childhood was so picture perfect despite the difficult start because of my sister. But unfortunately, like throughout our childhood and then even onto our adulthood, I feel like she's always sacrificed so much for me to be able to achieve. And she's actually training for the Olympics herself. She's training in the sport of shooting. And it was nice for me to be able to retire because it was like I could really stand back and give her moment. And yeah, she's been an amazing support for me and she always will be. And we are the best of friends. But it's hard for me to be able to look at our relationship without thinking of all the things that, in a way, because of my cancer and my sporting career, that there are a lot of opportunities that I took away from her so that I could get them. And now I think for me, I owe her for the rest of my life. And I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure that she's happy. And if she wants to go to the Olympics, we'll support her to get there. If she wants to do something else, we'll support her to get there. But she's been an amazing person in my life. And I definitely would not have been able to achieve everything that I have if she wasn't around.
As a child, I would imagine it is difficult being told the things you can't do. So how does that compare to the joy of being told you're on your first Australian Paralympic team in 2008 for the Beijing Games?
It was interesting. The moment I left hospital, my parents were given this whole list of things that I would struggle with. And they were really simple things that I look back at now being like, well, that's interesting. And it really taught me a lot about the, medical model of disability, where if you look at someone that has a disability or an impairment, and, you look at them as what that impairment is disabling them to do. Of course, that's the way that the doctors were going to look at me. But throughout the last 20 years of having a disability, we've really shifted it in our society towards more of the social model. So changing our environment to accommodate as many people as we can to be able to achieve what we're able to achieve. In sport, it was hard for me growing up with a disability because the Olympic team and the able-bodied team, well, obviously the Australian swim team, we all know what they're like. They're so idolised, and for very good reason. We're the best in the world and have been for such a long time. But the Paralympic team were always an afterthought, and they were always the ones that, if funding got cut, it was always from our program. It was always really challenging to see, the Olympic team staying in these incredible hotels. And then I remember this one hotel we stayed in with the Paralympic team where we were all expected to share like this giant room with like 15 bunk beds in there. And it was hard growing up in an environment where I knew that I wanted to achieve amazing things as an elite athlete, but I wasn't necessarily receiving the support from either the sporting organisations. I was from my swimming club, but from various different people. And that was always really challenging. So for me to be able to be told that I couldn't do or achieve the same things as somebody that had two legs growing up, it probably could have been quite detrimental, but for me it really was a fire in my belly to show people what I could actually do. So to then be announced on my first Paralympic team when I was like 16 was so exciting. I don't think I understood the gravity of the Paralympic Games in that moment though, because for me, I knew I was just like, I could leave school for about 3 months, go and travel off to Beijing in 2008 and represent Australia. I didn't really realise, I suppose, the responsibility that an athlete can have and the impact that an athlete can have in a wider sense, probably until I was much older. So I did have a very good time over there in Beijing. I won a silver and 2 bronze, which was really surprising for everybody, including myself. But I think it was probably more a catalyst than anything for the rest of my career. I wish that a lot of athletes that went to their first Olympics or Paralympics could just like put the L plates on and understand that first games is, you know, a real experience to understand what the whole movement, Olympics or Paralympics, is really about. I definitely had my L plates on. I didn't know what I was doing.
And a little known fact is that you had a little foray into basketball as well.
Yeah, I did. So I competed at 2 Paralympic Games in swimming before I decided to try a bit of basketball. The reason why I decided wheelchair basketball in particular was I had a double shoulder reconstruction after London, and I took some time out of the pool. And I went along to this like come and try wheelchair basketball day, and my shoulders were still so strong from my swimming career. And I was incredibly competitive. And so I would kind of just barge my way into the key. Someone would throw me the ball. I would shoot it towards the hoop. It would miss 99% of the time. But a lot of the coaches from the Australian team saw my competitive nature, my strength, my ability to pick up skills and take instructions from being an athlete really, really well, and decided that they might want to start, you know, making me into this Australian wheelchair basketball player. But I ended up going back into swimming as my first love. And I don't regret it, because then I went on to compete at another 2 Paralympic Games after that.
You end up winning 6 gold, 5 silver and 6 bronze medals at the Paralympics. How did the Paralympic movement change in that time from 2008 in your first team to 2021 in Tokyo when you finished with the Australian swim team?
I don't think I've ever seen anything like the way that the Paralympic movement has changed the perception of an entire minority group in such a short amount of time. It was pretty remarkable. You know, if I look back at Beijing 2008, I had only really just learnt what the Paralympic Games was. It wasn't on television. It definitely wasn't really reported on that widely. In fact, even if you look back now historically, you'd probably be hard-pressed to find a lot of media content around the Beijing Paralympic Games. And I remember, you know, swimming and winning 3 medals and coming home back to the airport. There wasn't really any media waiting. It was like my mum and dad and my siblings. If we go fast forward 4 years to London 2012, they did an incredible job at running those games, Olympics and Paralympics. And I remember around the Paralympic Games, in the lead up to the Games, they ran this campaign called Meet the Superhumans. It was this incredible campaign about how Paralympic athletes were like superhuman in a way. It was just, it's an awesome ad. I encourage you to watch it. It's on YouTube. And the whole country and the whole of the United Kingdom really just fell in love with this Paralympic movement. And I remember going to London the year after 2012 and competing in swimming. And I was walking down the street with a short-statured girl, myself, who was a leg amputee, Ahmed Kelly, who has no arms and no legs, and Grant Scooter Patterson, who's a tiny guy on a little scooter. And I was thinking, we're going to be a real sight here, and we're going to get a lot of people do double takes. And we went down the street and no one looked at us twice. And it was just bizarre for me to always be stared at in the streets of Australia, to go to the UK and no one even looking twice at what, honestly, it sounded like the start of a joke, like the 4 of us walking down the street. And it was incredible, the support that the United Kingdom gave to the Paralympic team from GB, and completely changed the story of the Paralympics. But then when we moved forward another 4 years to the Rio 2016 games, there was a lot of issues around the way that those games were managed by the organising committee. The Olympics started to run out of money, and so they took the money from the Paralympics and put it into the Olympics. So by the time we got there, we had effectively run out of money to even run the games, and so everything got cut. And like there was pretty much no bus schedules in the dining hall. There was like 2 stalls open for 600 athletes or even more, thousands of athletes. And I really remember sitting there thinking like this is a huge step back from London and thinking that it would always continue to be that way. And I was actually planning to retire after Rio, but then I was like, there's no way I can retire after games like this. It was an awful experience actually to go to those games. And so I decided to commit to Tokyo because I knew the Japanese were going to run an incredible games. And a couple of years training in towards Tokyo, then COVID happens. And I was like, of course, it's going to be games that is not going to live up to the potential that it really has. But, you know what Tokyo was like. It was incredible experience despite COVID, despite all the lockdowns and COVID testing and limited ability to move around. It was an incredible games. And the silver lining, I won't say the wonderful thing is, but the silver lining in it is that the Australian community were all at home. The Olympics and Paralympics was this beacon of light in this period of darkness for the world. And I think people really fell in love with our Paralympic team during the Tokyo Games. And obviously the huge announcement of pay parity as well was incredibly important there.
You may not remember, but I interviewed you on that day that happened, I believe even potentially before your race where you won your 17th medal at the Paralympics. And that was a huge day for all involved, wasn't it? With the announcement from the federal government that there would be pay parity with prize money for Olympic and Paralympic athletes. You posted a video on social media, I believe, on the morning of your race, quite emotional at what that meant, given that you had been one of the oldest members of the team and sort of seen that from the beginning. How was that day to then deal with that and then get up and race?
Yeah, I remember that day really well. And I remember that interview. I think you were the only interview that I did about the pay parity, actually. That announcement for me really took me by surprise. Initially, I thought that all of Australia knew that Paralympians weren't paid in the same way as Olympic athletes in terms of prize money. And that wasn't the case at all. Australia didn't know. And when they did find out eventually, there was absolute outrage from all Australians about why, Olympians were being paid prize money and Paralympians weren't. And for me, as a Paralympian, that was really nice to see our country stand up for people with disabilities, Paralympic athletes, because I'd seen it drip fed to me and I could see it improving over time, but that was an avalanche of support from Australia. And the announcement itself made me really emotional because my whole life I had been fighting to be seen as equal. I spent my swimming career training in Olympic training programs. I trained alongside Kate and Bronte Campbell for 3 years. And I would always go off to separate competitions and always be treated so differently. And it wasn't just me, it was our whole Paralympic team that I was fighting for to be seen as these incredible elite athletes that we are. This pay parity announcement did make me emotional because I think it was just 2 decades of that fighting and me being absolutely exhausted, the end of my career. And that announcement was made on the very last day of my Paralympic career. Like, it was almost poetic. You couldn't write that. And I did the interview with you about what it meant. And then I went off to the swimming pool and I raced my last ever race for Australia at a Paralympic Games. And that was in a relay. And we won a bronze medal that night. And I remember warming up for that event and I was still crying from the announcement. My goggles were filling up with tears and I had to keep emptying them in the warm-up pool. And I remember pulling myself out of the pool, sitting on the edge and looking at the pool, all of these competitors warming up and just taking in that last moment and reflecting on how much the Paralympics has changed. And it was a big, big day for us. Now, winning that medal that night, it made me Australia's most decorated female Paralympian. That was my 17th medal. We won a bronze in the relay. But what was really special about that race in particular is because the announcement was made, I was sharing the podium with this young girl who was only 15 years old, and her name's Izzy Vincent. It was her first Paralympic Games, and she was at a really similar age to when I started in the Paralympics. And her and I went back to the Athletes Village, just her and I, together that night after the announcement was made. And I asked Izzy what it meant to her to be receiving prize money and recognition in that sense for the first time ever. And her ever was much shorter than my ever. But I remember she told me she was going to buy a car, and she was really excited, and she was really focused on, like, you know, as a 15-year-old, I think she'd won like $15,000 or something. It was a lot of money for a 15-year-old. She was stoked, obviously.
Understandably.
But I kind of smiled at her. I'm like, no, but what does it mean to you? Like, what does this mean to you, the announcement? And she's like, yeah, it's good. And I was like, okay, you don't really get what I mean in terms. I'm like, you know that Paralympians for the last 65 years have never been paid up until this moment, right? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, and what does that mean to you? She's like, yeah, it's good. And then I almost started thinking like, okay, I need to like give her a bit of a history lesson on the Paralympics here. But then I was like, no, I'm just going to leave it, because she doesn't really need to understand how hard we had to fight. She doesn't need to understand what we went through as Paralympic athletes. And she was in a very different generation in terms of sport than what I was. And she was going to go for the rest of her career being seen in a way that the Paralympians before her never were. And I remember thinking, like, that's just such a nice moment. Like, we actually separated paths, and I knew she was quite literally going to be going down a very different path than what I did. And I remember thinking, like, that is worth more than any gold medal, like that moment. And I can guarantee that since that day, I've thought about that conversation almost every day with Izzy since that happened. And I can guarantee that she's not thought about that conversation once. There is no way she's thought about that conversation again.
If only they'd backdated your prize money. I think I asked you that at the time, and unfortunately they didn't, so we move on.
That's fine. I'm happy with what we got in the end.
The issue of classification is a tricky one in Paralympic sport. With prize money in, do you see issues with that in the future where athletes, given that money is at stake, might try and gain an advantage with classification? Like, where do you see that issue at?
The integrity of Paralympic sport is at a very high risk at the moment. You know, if you think about able-bodied sport, obviously a lot of focus on how to gain an advantage is around doping. And so obviously that's heavily criticised, which is the way it should be, and it's very heavily moderated, and there are very strict standards with what athletes are and aren't able to take. Like, when I was an athlete, I wasn't even allowed to take cold and flu medication. So in the able-bodied world, that's the issues that they have at hand. In the Paralympic world, we have this thing called intentional misrepresentation. And we are already seeing a few cases here and there from around the world of this happening. And effectively, why it's happening is, like you've just said, Paralympic sport is becoming, very heavily sponsored. You can, as an athlete, get brand endorsements, prize money. You can actually earn a living for the first time ever. And because of this, we are seeing more athletes who are going to their classification process and maybe intentionally misrepresenting what their disability is or the severity of their disability, trying to be put into a different classification than what they actually should be. And it's really hard. It is really, really hard to catch these athletes that are doing that, because, for example, if you have cerebral palsy and you have quite a severe case, if you start training in the sport of swimming, you can become stronger and you can learn how to use your body a little bit better. Then a lot of athletes, the consequence of that is that when they go back to classification, they say, oh, your disability is not as bad as it was before, so we're going to move you into this class instead. And so there needs to be like a sense of what their actual disability impairment is versus what their training has been able to do, and vice versa. And so we are seeing athletes begin to intentionally misrepresent what their disability is. Unfortunately, there is a lot of commentary around the athletes as well. But at the end of the day, athletes, we aren't medical professionals, we aren't doctors. We don't know what people's disabilities really are or what impact that has on their life. So it's really hard for us to make comment on that, but it still happens. The International Paralympic Committee are doing the best that they can. Paralympics Australia, we're doing the best that we can as well. We've actually have a panel where we go through, suggested cases where it may be happening here. We hope that it isn't, but it's probably likely going to begin to happen in every country, particularly as the Paralympics gains more and more momentum, which is happening very quickly. It's like a steam train that you can't stop, the Paralympics. So I'm really thankful at the beginning of my career. I never felt like I was competing against athletes that had an unfair advantage over me. But towards the back end of my career, I definitely saw cases where I would be competing against people that had 2 arms and 2 legs that were box jumping 100 centimetres. But as an athlete, I couldn't do anything about that. So I just had to do the best that I could to try and produce the best times and give Australia the best chance to make the podium. But it's so frustrating as an athlete when you put everything that you can into something and then you see somebody come into your classification that, almost looks completely able-bodied and smokes you out of the water. There's nothing you can do about it.
You've kept very busy in retirement. So I wouldn't call it retirement. You've been so busy, it's barely retirement. You were lucky enough to be in Paris for Channel 9 doing Olympics poolside interviews at the pool. How does that compare to being an athlete? What did you make of that experience? And as someone who has done that, I know the scary element of live telly, but on a level like that where all of Australia is watching, how did you feel about the privilege of being able to ask the first question of Australia's swimmers coming out and winning medals?
It's a huge privilege, and I know you've done this before with the Australian swim team as well. Our Australian swim team is incredible. So to have the chance to be that first point of contact when they get out of the pool after what could arguably be the biggest moment of their life or the biggest disappointment up to that date, it's a massive responsibility. And as an athlete, I know exactly what those feelings that they're going through are. For Emma McKeon, who was racing at her last Olympics, I know how it feels to get out of the pool after her career was like probably the same length as mine, almost 16 years, and walk away from that stadium for the last time. It's so emotional. And it was hard because on one hand, I was the old athlete who had grown up with all of these swimmers and knew so many very personal things about them and what they were experiencing themselves as well. And then on the other hand, I was also just this massive swimming fan who was so excited to be there. So I had to kind of try and blend both of those two things together. But at the end of the day, I know that when I was an athlete and I was being interviewed, I really wanted the person first to come out of this interview. And I wanted to make sure that I was giving these athletes the same opportunity that, at the end of the day, it was their moment. And it was nice for me to be there, but it was their moment. And there was something pretty cool, though, about in Tokyo, watching Ariane Titmus and Katie Ledecky and all of that, and then being over in Paris and seeing that same race play out again, and then seeing like Arnie walk up and then Katie walk past me. I was seriously the biggest swimming fan. I was like getting selfies with all these cool athletes in the background that I'd seen on TV, but I'd never seen in real life because, well, the Paralympics is different. I was always training when the Olympics are on. So I was just so excited to be there. But I didn't know if I told you, when I was over in Paris, I can't speak any French. I thought I was eating yogurt every morning for breakfast.
Right.
I was apparently eating a bowl of cheese for like a whole week.
I do love the queso over there, the cheese.
It looks just like Greek yogurt, and it almost tastes the same in some sense. But I just loved the experience of being over there, being in a country where I couldn't speak the language, and when the Olympics were on, and it being the hotel with all the nine crew, and how amazingly accommodating the Channel 9 team were, and lovely, and I had the best time. I really did, and I hope I get to do every Olympics from now until I'm like 150, because it was a really good time.
We did a fabulous job, but unfortunately we, the reporters in the stadium, can't hear your commentary. We can see you down there and we're up the back a little bit. So I remember sitting next to James Magnussen during Arnie's 400 free win, and that was just special, a huge moment. And the stadium was rocking, completely different to Tokyo on many different levels. So
what was it like to be with Maggie there? Because obviously he's experienced, well, as a Paralympian, I've experienced something very similar, obviously being at the Paralympics. But you were sitting next to an Olympian who was racing the pool at the Olympics. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, obviously we know Maggie's story at the Olympics, coming so close in the 100 free. but it was really cool. I was in a sort of overflow section, and the 400 freestyle with Ariane, you could sort of soak it in across 8 laps, and you saw the storyline playing out a little bit different to Cam McAvoy, who won the 50 metres freestyle. It's over in 21 seconds. So we sort of had time to soak it in. And on that final turn at the 350, we just knew she was home, and we could soak it in as Australians, but also enjoying swimming and the beauty of it, and knowing her story and what she'd built up to it. So it was really, really nice. It was a very cool moment. But before we run out of time, let's talk about the book. The children's book that you have poured your heart and soul into. It is called Felix and His Fantastic Friends. I read it last night, and I thought to myself, it's a book that I would have loved to have as a kid. It's a book that I will be giving to my niece, and I think it's really important that all kids do read it. Felix is your 1-year-old, inspired. Can you just give us a little bit of a background on why and Felix, and also the characters in the book as well, who I would imagine are based on some friends you've grown up with?
They are. They're all the characters in the book are based off people that I know, inspired by people that I know. Dash is a character in there. He's a double leg amputee, was inspired by Vanessa Lowe, one of our greatest Paralympians in athletics. But Felix and His Fantastic Friends. So I have a 1-year-old named Felix, and I did this reality television show last year. It's very well known. You go into a jungle for a month. I won't say what the show is, but when I was in there, I began to think about, Felix is only 5 weeks old, and I began to think that he'll go to school one day and someone's going to point out his mum has a disability, which has happened to a lot of my Paralympic friends that have kids. And it's always ends in tears. And I've never understood why, because from what I've seen, being a Paralympian, having a disability is awesome. And I absolutely love it. Like the practical jokes you can play on people and stuff. But it really got me thinking that I really wanted to try and change the narrative with kids around being different and how amazing it is to be different. And I wanted Felix to be really proud that his mum has a disability and is different. But it kind of got me thinking that, you know, our generation, you and I, we're not very disability confident. A lot of people aren't very confident to discuss disability or what questions to ask, what terminology to ask. And I think it's really important that we try and educate the kids now about disability confidence. And so I started doing a bit of research on disability children's books, and a lot of the characters of disability children's book have a disability themselves, the main characters. And so I actually wanted my main character to be able-bodied, and for him to go through the world and meet all of these different types of disabilities. And for the book, it's set in a playground, and to learn about them, to approach each person in a very different way, to engage them to be able to play. And I think that was really important. For example, one of the characters in my book is hearing impaired, and they end up deciding that they're going to communicate just by drawing a picture of a pirate ship in the sand, and then they go off and play their pirate games. And so I really wanted to give parents as well as kids this resource to be able to use, to be able to talk about disability and what it means, but to also give them the tools to be able to take into real life action, to be able to invite kids to be able to just play. And at the end of the day, I want, no matter what kid goes to primary school, regardless of their cultural background or their abilities, to be able to all be engaged in play and to all feel like they have a place where they can belong. And everybody has a responsibility to do that. I think the onus is always put on that child that's different, but it should be everybody. And so that's why I really wanted to write Felix and His Fantastic Friends, to give every kid the tools that they need to be able to include everybody in play. And the feedback that I've received from the book so far has been so great. People are loving the diversity of the characters and the diversity when it comes to the different types of disabilities. And their parents are having discussions with their kids for the first time ever about how to approach this subject matter that they're not that confident about. And I'm getting lots of thank yous from parents because they've never known how to approach this topic of disability before. And this is a resource where they can sit down with their kids and talk about it.
Characters and the way that they interact with Felix is so beautiful. Do the real life humans know that they are the characters in your book, or is there a bit of mystery around it?
There's a little bit of mystery around it. I know Vanessa Lowe knows that Dash is inspired by her. I don't know if I should say this, but one of my best friends that I used to train with, Tanya, she's in the book, but I haven't told her.
Okay, there you go, exclusive.
So there you go, Tanya. I'm just going to send her a copy. But no, she definitely inspired one of my characters. And then Nellie, who she's on the autism spectrum, she's actually a spitting image, the character illustration, everything, of a girl that lives up the road from me who's a family friend of ours, and she sits on the autism spectrum. So I wanted to create a character that looked exactly like her, that, you know, she controlled the narrative of who that character was. And to be able to give that book to her and say, like, this is you in a book, absolutely, like, it put the biggest smile on her face, and it meant a lot to her and her parents and her family as well. But it's just so nice for me to be able to give a book, put a book out there that exposes children to disabilities. But I've seen what representation has done in sport, and I want to see that in the playground. And so it's been nice to be able to create a nice little handy resource to be able to do that.
Well, hopefully it does make a huge impact, and it is a very good book, so I'd highly recommend checking it out. And I mean that sincerely. It's really, really good. My last question is, since you've retired and kept busy and doing all sorts of things, what inspires you to get out of bed in the morning and motivates you?
Usually Felix waking up and crying to get me out of bed. No, I've thoroughly enjoyed retirement. I still do wake up very early. I think I always will, being a swimmer, but it's nice to be able to wake up and not run straight out the door anymore and go and swim 6 kilometres in a pool. For me, I really enjoyed the back end of my swimming career, seeing the impact that we can have, well, the athletes can have, without necessarily needing to win gold medals, you know, being really good role models and teaching the world about the strengths that we all have within us. And that's what really inspires me. I love getting out into our communities. I love getting out into businesses and getting to know a variety of different people, and just showcasing all of the lessons that I learned as a Paralympian. It's so much fun, and I love doing it. Very passionate about inclusion and disability and opportunities for everybody. And because I've seen the impact it's had on my own life, but the impact it's had on so many Paralympians and other people with disabilities all around the country. So it's not hard to get out of bed when you're inspired by something as important as that.
Ellie Cole, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
That was Ellie Cole, the decorated Paralympian, broadcaster and now children's book author, on the latest Good Weekend Talks. Coming soon, we chat with Melinda Gates, the American philanthropist, about what one does with $30 billion. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts, and keep tuning in for more compelling conversations. Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Proud newsrooms powered by subscriptions. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Conrad Marshall and edited by Tim Mummery, with technical assistance from Josh Towers. Our executive producer is Tammy Mills, Tom McKendrick is head of audio, and Greg Callahan is the acting editor of Good Weekend.